watching Aljazeera's continuing coverage of Russia's attack against Ukraine. Here are the latest developments. Ukrainian tanks and soldiers are taking up positions on empty streets across the capital, Kiev, in preparation for a Russian assault. Ukraine's president has appealed for talks with Vladimir Putin to end the fighting. The Russian president's proposed talks in Belarus. That's where his troops are stationed. Also, a video has emerged of a tank in northern Kiev running over a car. People passing by later ran to rescue the passenger inside. Also, weapons have been distributed to Kiev residents ready to take up arms. Ukraine has barred men aged 18 to 60 from leaving. And rockets have hit residential buildings for a second day. Families have been hiding in makeshift shelters. There's also fierce fighting in several other cities. Russia's military claims it seized an airport 10 kilometers outside Kiev. Meanwhile, the UN's refugee agency says the violence has displaced 100,000 Ukrainians, with more families streaming to the Polish border. Well, military analysts suggest that Russian forces are trying to create a corridor connecting the separatist-held eastern regions to Russian-annexed Crimea in the south. Charles Stratford has more from Berdansk in southeastern Ukraine.
Behind me is the port, the naval port of Berdansk. Now, we're here because we got a tip-off from a high naval source yesterday who told us that naval personnel, Ukrainian naval personnel, had left their positions here. We've come, spoken to security guards on the base, and they have confirmed that. They said that naval personnel left in the last 24 hours or so. Our source is telling us that the reason why they left is because they had been warned by the Russian Navy that if they didn't, then the Russian Navy would shell the port and potentially the city. That's what we have been told. Of course, as you can see, the streets are pretty much deserted here. We were here about a month ago. The naval base was obviously functioning. The streets were busy. It's all changed, seemingly, in the last 48 hours. We also know that according to the mayor of Mariupol, which is around 100 kilometers east of here, that there is ongoing fighting in the east of the city. The mayor of Mariupol saying that tanks were approaching, saying that there was an evacuation for people who wanted to leave the city. We're also hearing reports of fighting going on around about 100 kilometers to the west, around a town called Melitopol. What this suggests, although we cannot confirm it, is that there seems to be an effort by Russian forces both to the west of here and to the east, a pincer movement that is consistent with what military analysts had predicted, that Russian forces would want to create a corridor between the separatist-controlled region in the east and Russian-annexed Crimea to the west.
Dmitry Bridzy is a political analyst based in Moscow, and he says President Putin seeks regime change and will likely invade the whole of Ukraine.
It's obvious that Putin wants to take over control over Kiev, and it was the plan that Putin was trying to do. It was like from the beginning when he recognized Donetsk and Lugansk as two republics. It was obvious that Putin is not only planning to take control over Donetsk and Lugansk, but also as it took Crimea. It's obvious that he was planning to take control over Kiev, and he was planning to change the government there, because it's obvious that the government there, the local government in Kiev, is not a government that will support Putin's agenda or plans for Europe or to fight against NATO, and also is trying to take revenge on Ukraine, because Ukraine was trying to join NATO, and so it's obvious that Putin now sees NATO as an enemy. So it was obvious when he spoke in his speech. It's obvious that he sees Ukraine as a Nazi country, and it's obvious that he sees NATO as a big enemy for Russia, and obvious that he's trying to also get popular in Russia, because after 2 years we have elections in Russia, presidential elections, and also that Putin is not popular as it was in the past now. So it's obvious a big war is good for Putin for his agenda and for his popularity in Russia and for elections. So it's obvious that we have now two categories of people, that one part of one category is that supporting the war, and they see that Putin is helping the Russians in Ukraine, and other part that they are against the war and see Putin's war is a big problem for Russians and for Russian economy.
Well, Ukraine has asked Turkey to shut the Bosphorus and Dardanelles to block Russian warships. Turkey can close the sea route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea if it feels threatened. Russia has already moved a fleet of warships and tanks landing vessels from bases in northern Russia to attack Ukraine from the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. Other Russian warships have been spotted off the coast of Syria in the eastern Mediterranean. Turkey shares the Black Sea with Russia and Ukraine and has a good relationship with both. Well, Turkey has yet to respond to Ukraine's request to shut Russian access to the Black Sea. Sinem Kosovoglu has more from Istanbul.
Because Turkey has strong relations with both countries, Ukraine and Russia, everything is critical at the stage for Ankara and the Turkish government. That's why they have been trying to take very cautious steps in their official statements, written or oral statements. And this is what President Erdogan said a week ago. He said Turkey can neither give up on Ukraine nor on Russia because Turkey has strong economic ties with those two countries. So this is a critical stage, and Turkey has some strategic cooperation with Russia, a complicated relationship in Syria and Libya, despite Turkey is a prominent NATO ally. However, this international treaty that was signed in 1936, the Montreal Convention, gives Turkey a right to shut down its straits, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, to the warships entering in Black Sea. But for this to be intact, Turkey must be defining the incident as war. So what is going on between Ukraine and Russia must be defined as war by the Turkish authorities. And on the way back from Kazakhstan, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu told reporters that the experts at the Foreign Ministry are now evaluating the situation. So what is going on between Russia and Ukraine? Is it an invasion? Is it a war? Is it a military intervention or an annexation?
Well, as we reported earlier, European sanctions have stopped short of blocking Russia from the Belgium-based SWIFT global payment system. Durag McDowell, is a political and economic risk consultant. He says cutting Russia off from the SWIFT global payment system could be a challenge.
Even if you do cut Russia off from SWIFT, you're not making it impossible to do business with Russian banks. You're not stopping all forms of communication with those banks. You're just stopping communication through this mechanism, SWIFT. Now that's important because SWIFT is the mechanism that's the standard across the banking industry. It's also the most secure one. If Russian banks are forced to use other mechanisms, they're less secure, and a lot of Western banks or a lot of banks all over the world may simply say, actually, you know what, we don't want to do business through these mechanisms, and it will increase the cost and the friction of doing that. What's more important from a financial and economic perspective is some of the blocking sanctions that we've already seen the U.S. introduce against Russian banks like Sberbank and Vatava, which prevents them from interacting with the dollar economy. To put it one way, if you think of you're talking to your friend through WhatsApp, if you suddenly have a restriction saying, hey, you can't communicate with this person through WhatsApp, you can still communicate with them through other means. What the U.S. is saying with the blocking sanctions is you can't communicate with them at all. So that's the kind of difference here. It's a matter of the difficulty of setting up alternative systems or security, whether they'll be accepted. But in terms of greater impact, what we've seen from U.S. sanctions and some of the EU sanctions so far is a bit more impactful in that it rules out any communication or any interaction with these banks entirely.
The UN is predicting up to 5 million people could flee the fighting into surrounding countries. UNICEF is boosting its response to support those in need.
Clearly, in the last few days, the needs of children and families are escalating in line with the conflict. As many of you have seen, evacuations are ongoing in Luhansk Oblast and have started in Donetsk. Needs are wide, ranging from hygiene products to blankets, gas burners, fuel, first aid kits. UNICEF, along with the rest of the UN family, has called on all parties to protect children at all times. and to ensure that humanitarian actors can safely and quickly reach children in need wherever they are. We will be working with UNHCR and other UN agencies in the coming days for a flash appeal for the surrounding countries. That will include Moldova, Romania, and Poland as a first call, and then obviously Hungary and Slovenia as well.
Well, refugees from Ukraine are arriving in Slovakia by car and by train. Slovakia's government has lifted all coronavirus restrictions for Ukrainians escaping Russia's attack and will open more border crossings if necessary.
Plan is good, but I hope everything will okay, and 1-2 weeks maybe we coming back at home, because we normally building home 5 years and now I live this. So what I can do?
Friends will come for us, and then we'll see what will happen in Ukraine. Nobody knows what will happen next.
Marin Vrsic has more from the Slovakia-Ukraine border.
Unlike yesterday evening, today you can't see any men passing the border from Ukraine to Slovakia, as everybody who is 18 or older have to stay and fight. They found out that they're going to be faster if they pass this border crossing Ubla by foot. You can see mothers with children and families passing, and now they're calling taxi from the Slovakian side. They all say they have the same plan, just to flee from Ukraine, from the devastating war, and they're all hoping that this is not gonna be a long-term war. All in all, many of them have either relatives or friends where they go to. Many persons I've spoken to said that they were waiting on this border crossing couple of hours, some of them even from 2 o'clock in the morning. On this side you can see Slovakian Caritas who is helping them. They provide them some food and snacks and tea just to warm them up, but in the case they need also some shelter or a legal advice, they're always here to help. For the time being, Slovakian Minister of Interior said that the situation is stable on border crossings with Ukraine.
Now, another country which knows all about Russian invasion is Georgia. 14 years after Russian troops attacked them, Georgians have denounced the Kremlin's latest onslaught. Robin Forestier-Walker has the story from the capital, Tbilisi.
Freedom Square in Tbilisi tonight is completely occupied by thousands of Georgians and also many people from abroad. There are many Ukrainians living in Tbilisi, many Ukrainian expats. They've come out to show their disgust at the invasion that has been taking place in Ukraine.
In the morning I was feeling desperate. It is horrible. We don't need war in the 21st century. Ukraine don't need Putin in Ukraine, so please leave.
Georgians and Ukrainians really consider themselves brothers and sisters in arms. That's because Georgia experienced 14 years ago what is happening now in Ukraine. The South Ossetian territory of Georgia was invaded by Russian forces, later recognized as a republic. Although territorially, of course, it is considered internationally part of Georgia. So Georgians are experiencing a sense of deja vu about what they have been seeing today happening in Ukraine. There's a lot of fear about what's been going on and concern, of course, about what is going to now transpire.
We need to stop Russia, to stop invading Ukraine, because next there will be other European countries. First it was Georgia, then Ukraine, and next other countries.
They are a very strong nation, and we all support them, the whole world, and they should keep on fighting no matter what the cost for their freedom, and Georgians will help them in any way we can.
Georgians feel vulnerable. Russian military bases are stationed just a few dozen kilometers away from the capital, and they're fearful about what could happen next, because given the unprecedented invasion anything now seems possible in this region.
Well, protesters in Australia and New Zealand have joined the outrage at Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Dozens of demonstrators in Sydney demanded more government action against Russia. And in New Zealand, protesters picketed the Russian embassy in the capital, Wellington, demanding the Kremlin ends the war. Similar demonstrations have been held in various other countries. Sonia Gallego reports from London.
From Stockholm to Berlin, Tokyo, and Beirut. This is the anger over Russia's invasion of Ukraine around the world. In London, a crowd outside the Prime Minister's Downing Street residence making its demand loud and clear, calling for a complete economic isolation of Russia and the worry that many here have for their families back home.
I was shocked. My mom called me, it was 5 o'clock, 4:30 in the morning here, and what happened, she was like, Russians attacked. They really did.
We are watching minute by minute what's happening there, and most of them are not safe.
While Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that unprecedented measures have been prepared to punish Russia, many here feel that it is too little too late. And while the rest of the world may be shocked at the invasion of Ukraine, many Ukrainians living abroad are not. In France, home to some 30,000 Ukrainians, hundreds gathered outside the Russian embassy in Paris, singing. Others shouted for an end to the invasion. And many more gathered elsewhere in the city, all condemning the assault. But, like many others around the world, determined to show their solidarity with Ukraine. Sonia Gallego, Aljazeera, London.
Well, Joe is here now to tell us how the world of sport has been reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Joe.
Doreen, thank you. Yes, the International Olympic Committee has urged sports organisations to relocate or cancel events planned in Russia or Belarus. European football's governing body has already done that with a major move stripping Russia of the Champions League final. Europe's most prestigious club game was due to be held in St. Petersburg on May the 28th, but it's now been moved to Paris. UEFA thanked French President Emmanuel Macron for his commitment to have the match moved to France at a time of unparalleled crisis. Well, UEFA has also decided Russian and Ukrainian club and national teams in European competitions are to play home games at neutral venues. But a decision is still to be made on World Cup qualifiers. That's FIFA's responsibility. Russia are due to play Poland in a World Cup playoff in Moscow next month, with Sweden and Czech Republic also in line to possibly play in Russia.
FIFA expresses hope for a rapid cessation of hostilities and for peace in Ukraine. FIFA condemns as well the use of force by Russia in Ukraine and any type of violence to resolve conflicts.
Manchester United have announced they've cancelled their 10-year sponsorship deal with Russia's national airline Aeroflot. The airline had been United's official carrier since 2013, and they used it to take them to European games. The deal was thought to be worth more than $53 million. United did not fly with Aeroflot to Spain this week for their game with Atletico Madrid in the Champions League. The UK government has banned Aeroflot from landing in Britain. Formula One has cancelled this season's Russian Grand Prix. The race was due to be held on September the 25th in Sochi, but F1 say it's impossible to hold the race in the current circumstances and hopes for a swift and peaceful resolution to the present situation.
Like everyone said, innocent people losing their lives, people losing their homes and families and don't have safe places to live in. It's not right, but well, we can hope that everything gets resolved in the best possible outcome and way that is possible. And for now, I think it's the right decision by Formula One not to go to Russia. It's so hard to predict the future, what it's going to be in a few months. So definitely, I'm pretty sure that all the drivers agree with that decision.
Meanwhile, players from Ukraine's national basketball team say they're concerned about family and friends back home as they wait for news in Spain. They were playing Spain's national team in a World Cup qualifier on Thursday, just after news of Russia's attack broke. The return leg in Kiev has been postponed. In the NBA, the Sacramento Kings and the Denver Nuggets held a moment of silence in a show of solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Sacramento's Alex Len is one of only 2 active Ukrainian players in the league. The world's #1 tennis player in waiting, Daniil Medvedev, says his mind has been focused on events back home. The Russian will take over the top spot after Novak Djokovic suffered a surprise defeat in Dubai.
In this moment, you understand that tennis sometimes is not that important, and definitely a lot of feelings when I woke up. Then Novak lost, and actually before the match I didn't even know that I'm going to become #1 if he loses no matter what. So then a lot of messages, and I understood that it's happening. More emotions.
His fellow countryman Andrei Rublev made his feelings clear following his semi-final win, writing "No war please" on a camera lens. He's previously called for peace and unity. All right, that is all your sport for now. It is back to Doreen.
Joe, thank you so much. Well, that's it from me this hour, but we'll be back in just a couple of minutes right after the break with our continuing coverage of the Russian attack on Ukraine. But we do leave you with a look at the panic that's being felt by civilians in Kiev. This was the scene earlier on Friday. You'll see it in just a moment, just outside the main train station where people are seeking shelter. The Russian president's proposed talks in Belarus, where his troops are stationed, though the Kremlin says Ukraine wants them to take place in NATO member Poland instead.
We can see the neo-Nazis are placing heavy weaponry in the central areas of big cities like Kiev and Kharkiv. They're planning to attract return fire from Russian units. They're acting as terrorists, using human shields to blame Russians for the victims. Clearly this is happening from the advice of foreign governments, particularly the Americans. I appeal to the soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces. Do not let the nationalists use your wives and parents as human shields.
We'll start off with Bernard Smith, who's joining us from Moscow. First, on the offer of talks, Bernard, what more are we learning about this?
Doreen, the Kremlin is telling us that the idea of talks move forward at the suggestion of the Ukrainians, and Vladimir Putin was interested in talks because their understanding was that Ukraine was ready to discuss its neutrality. And so the Kremlin says preparations were made to have talks in Minsk, but then Ukraine wanted to have the talks in Warsaw instead, and then, says the Kremlin, communications were cut off. What we don't know is the terms the Kremlin might have laid down for those talks, but that we do know that Vladimir Putin has also said today he's called on the Ukrainian army essentially to overthrow the government of Ukraine. He said it's going to be easier for us if you take power. That was in an address to the Russian military. And Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, he's arms, and he's also said that we want the Ukrainians to be independent and have the possibility to freely define their destiny. He says he sees no possibility of recognising the current Ukrainian government as democratic. But worth pointing out that the Ukrainian president was elected in 2019 with a 73% share of the vote. The problem, it seems, that Moscow has is with Vladimir Zelensky, although it seems there is an avenue for talks, but we don't know, as I say, where they're at and what those conditions are.
Okay, got it. And Bernard, what more do we know about why Russia has announced a partial restriction of access to Facebook?
Yeah, this has come out in the last half hour or so from the Russian telecoms regulator, and it says it's partially limiting access to Facebook, it says, because it's contributing to limiting basic rights and freedoms. Now, it's left people here puzzled as to what reasoning there is to limit access to Facebook, but There were protests on Thursday night in Moscow and many other Russian cities, spontaneous protests against the war, and a lot of celebrities and personalities and some opposition people have been posting on Facebook their opposition to the war. So the suggestion here that this is an attempt to slow down perhaps access to Facebook or make it harder for people to access Facebook because there is this growing sentiment, this growing leaking of information that there is opposition to this war in Russia.
All right, thank you so much. Bernard Smith reporting from Moscow. Well, despite Moscow pressing forward with the invasion, Ukraine's president, as you've been hearing, is appealing for talks with Vladimir Putin.
I want to appeal to the president of Russia. All of Ukraine is involved in fighting. Let's sit down and talk to stop people from dying. And now I want to appeal to the armed forces of Ukraine. Stay strong. You're everything that we've got, and everything that protects and defends our country.
Natasha Benaim has more on the day's developments.
A second dawn to Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine.
I hate Russians. I'm a little bit scared about my family and about my country. I don't want to go away from my land or my country. I will stay here. I will fight here for my freedom, for my independence, for my nation.
Devastation in the heart of the capital, Kiev. Ukrainian air defenses shot down a Russian jet overnight. Air raid sirens continue to pierce the sky. Russian tanks are reported to be on their way to the seat of power.
Even if our enemy will come here, I will stay.
The Kremlin has launched a multi-pronged attack by air, land, and sea. The military is hitting major cities across the country, including Kharkiv, Mariupol, and Dnipro.
If you look at the numbers, if you look at the equipment and the will, I think it's pretty obvious that the Russian forces will prevail at some point. What Putin wants to do is to impose the terms. He wants probably to have a regime that is seen as sympathetic to his twisted vision of this greater Russia.
Ukraine has banned all men between the ages of 18 and 60 from leaving the country. They're being told to stay and fight. Many are desperate to leave. After weeks of threats, people here simply didn't believe it could happen.
We are a peaceful country, we have peaceful people, we have absolutely modern thinking society, and for us and for me especially, this is invasion absolutely unbelievable.
Now, on day 2 of the onslaught, there are fears that the arrival of Russian soldiers in the heart of the capital is imminent. Natasha Benaim, Aljazeera.
Well, let's get you up to date with what else has been happening on the ground. So Russian forces paraded prisoners of war in Ukraine's eastern Luhansk region. Fierce fighting has raged on for a second day across Ukraine. That figure right there that you're seeing on your screen has emerged, and it shows a tank in northern Kiev swerving into and running over a car. People passing by had to later rescue the passenger inside once the tank had left the scene. And Russian forces are about 10 kilometers from the capital. They've encircled Kiev. Weapons have been distributed to residents ready to take up arms. Rockets have hit residential buildings for a second day. Families have been hiding in makeshift basement shelters, subway stations, as well as parking lots. The UN's refugee agency says the violence has displaced 100,000 Ukrainians, with more families streaming to the Polish border. Andrew Simmons is in Kiev. That's where he's been talking to a Ukrainian family seeking safety in one of the bomb shelters.
Svetlana, Aljazeera English, can I ask you just how, and I'm just going to get my microphone in a better place for you, just how are you coping with this situation?
Oh, we have to cope, but really we are just struggling by getting stuck in here. That's the thing that we can't escape at the moment. We're just trapped, to be honest.
And what do you think about the whole invasion and the way that Vladimir Putin is behaving?
It's just terrible. It's just not inappropriate. Any civil lost or whatever.
And what are your views towards Vladimir Putin and the sort of things that he's doing and saying?
Say it again.
What about Vladimir Putin? What do you think about what he's doing and saying?
Just mostly lying to the Russians, invading, just breaking international laws.
Are you scared?
We're quite, we overtook our fear during Maidan in 2012. And yeah, just, it's unpredictable, that's the thing. That's why we were scared, yeah.
The word is that tanks are only 12, 15 kilometres away now.
Say it again, please.
Were you aware that tanks are getting closer?
Yeah,
and the columns?
yeah, we know that. Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Stay here, the most safe place at the moment.
You're spending a lot of time in this shelter, are you?
Yeah. 2 nights in a row.
And what about your son? You must be...
Ask him. You can ask him.
Right. How are you feeling towards this? Are you hopeful?
Well, I'm scared and I'm also hopeful that we'll have a bright future. It's very terrifying, but we're coping, and I'm sure that in about a few days it should be fine now. It should settle a little bit.
Very optimistic, articulate young man there. Good luck to you both. I hope things progress in a positive way.
Let's cross over to Washington and speak to Heino Klink. He's a national security analyst and former director of U.S. Army International Affairs at the Pentagon. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Klink, on Al Jazeera. So how likely is it that the Russians will actually reach the center of Kiev, the capital, in the next couple of hours or the next couple of days?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's apparent that the center of gravity for the Russian military operation is, in fact, Kyiv, the political power center of Ukraine. I would imagine that the Russians do not want to fight house to house, engage in urban operations. So they will seek to isolate, surround Kyiv, and they've been largely successful. And much like a boa constrictor, slowly squeeze Kyiv while maintaining other axes of attack in north, the west, and the south of Ukraine in order to force the political leadership to capitulate.
Yeah, you say that there are 3 separate axes of attack taking place right now, the north, west, and the south. What is behind that strategy?
I think it is meant to ensure that the Ukrainians are forced into dividing their forces to contend with Russian attacks across the geography of the country. My understanding is that the Russians have just launched an amphibious assault against Mariupol as well, and given the overwhelming advantage in numbers that the Russian forces have, the Ukrainians are now having to spread themselves even thinner.
How would you gauge the way that the Ukrainians have fought back or pushed back so far?
Based on the public information that I have seen, the Ukrainians have fought back, quite frankly, very well, and perhaps have even surprised the Russians in some instances in the amount of resistance that they have put up, and that the Russian advances in certain parts have been slowed, and in some places actually reversed as well. However, we have to remember that the Russians have a preponderance of military forces that they can array against Ukraine, and that much of their force still has not even entered Ukraine.
So should we not be surprised by the fact that, according to reports so far, no population centers have been taken so far as we're aware?
I would imagine that the Russians are going to try to bypass major population centers, particularly if they can neutralize any Ukrainian defensive threat that might be posed from those population centers, because they do not want to get bogged down, again, in urban operations, which is very time-consuming and very costly in terms of materiel, people, and vehicles and the like. So it would not come as a surprise doctrinally from a military perspective to bypass some of those population
say that they do make it to the capital, Kiev, and I believe that's what you were saying you believe will likely happen. They might be able to take it, the Russians that is, but can they actually hold on to it?
So it all depends on, quite frankly, the Ukrainian will to fight. I believe that the unfortunate military truth is that the Russians will prevail against the Ukrainian military forces. And if they force the political leadership to either, again, capitulate, resign, or, as macabre as this may sound in 2022, they kill the political leadership, it will depend on then how are Ukrainian forces prepared to continue the fight without a central political command and control, and what do the Ukrainian people themselves do? There have been plenty of examples throughout history in Ukraine in particular of resistance, whether it was resistance to Nazi occupiers in World War II or resistance to Soviet occupiers before and afterwards. So the Ukrainian people have a history fighting for their homeland.
Yeah, and here's the thing, just one more for you while I have you with us. I mean, we have seen video, in fact, of weapons, and particularly AK-47s being handed out to citizens in Kiev. What do you make of that?
I think that that's a demonstrable example of the Ukrainian government wanting to be able to provide their citizenry with a means to defend themselves. And I think it's also meant as a not so subtle message to the Russian invaders that Ukrainians will stand and fight. And we have to remember that the Russians have experienced the same in places like Chechnya, in places like Georgia, and in Afghanistan as well.
Okay, we'll leave it there. We thank you so much, Heino Kling, for joining us from the U.S.
Thank you.
Now, NATO's 30 member states are holding a meeting in Brussels right now, and they're discussing how to respond to Russia's attack on Ukraine. The alliance's eastern members are concerned about their security, including Lithuania, which has declared a state of emergency. NATO is likely to decide whether to deploy its response force to Eastern European countries as a result.
What we have warned against for months has come to pass, despite all our efforts to find a diplomatic solution. Moscow bears sole responsibility for the deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned attacks.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg speaking in Brussels right now. Let's listen in.
In decades. I invited NATO's close partners, Finland, Sweden and the European Union to our summit because this crisis affects us all. Russia has shattered peace in Europe. The people of Ukraine are fighting for their freedom in the face of Russia's unprovoked invasion. We deplore the tragic loss of life, enormous human suffering and destruction. Our thoughts are with those killed, injured and displaced. We call on Russia to stop this senseless war. Immediately cease its assaults, withdraw all its forces from Ukraine, and turn back to the path of dialogue and turn away from aggression. The Kremlin's objectives are not limited to Ukraine. Russia has demanded legally binding agreements to announce further NATO enlargement and to remove troops and infrastructure from allies that joined after 1997. We are facing a new normal in European security, where Russia openly contests the European security order and uses force to pursue its objectives. The world will hold Russia and Belarus accountable for their actions. Russia as the aggressor, Belarus as the enabler. President Putin's decision to pursue his aggression against Ukraine is a terrible strategic mistake, for which Russia will pay a severe price for years to come. NATO allies and the European Union have already introduced significant sanctions, and many of our partners around the globe have joined us. We must stand ready to do more, even if it means we have to pay a price, because we are in this for the long haul. At the same time, the Russian people must know that Kremlin's war on Ukraine will not make Russia more secure. It will not make Russia more respected in the world. It will not lead to a better future for your children. In response to Russia's massive military build-up over the past months, we have already strengthened our deterrence and defense. Yesterday, NATO allies activated our defense plans. And as a result, we are deploying elements of the NATO response force on land, at sea and in the air, to further strengthen our posture and to respond quickly to any contingency. The United States, Canada and European allies have deployed thousands of more troops to the eastern part of the alliance. We have over 100 jets at high alert operating in over 30 different locations, and over 120 ships from the high north to the Mediterranean, including 3 strike carrier groups. There must be no space for miscalculation or misunderstanding. We will do what it takes to protect and defend every ally and every inch of NATO territory. Leaders today also made clear that we must continue our support to Ukraine. The Kremlin is trying to make NATO and the EU provide less support to our partners. So our collective answer must be more support to countries like Georgia, Moldova and Bosnia-Herzegovina, to help them succeed with their democratic reforms and pursue the path that they have freely chosen. More than ever, this crisis demonstrates the importance of North America and Europe standing together in NATO. There is no security in Europe without a strong transatlantic bond. With that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll go to Aljazeera.
James Bayes, Aljazeera. How fearful are you about the possible fall of Kyiv? How long, in your estimation, can the government of Ukraine last? And if we move to a resistance insurgency type situation, what support can NATO then give?
So what we see now is a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine from multiple directions with air, sea and land capabilities. And this is actually in line with what our intelligence services predicted over a long period of time, because we saw the build-up around Ukraine with air, sea and land forces. We see, of course, that they're moving towards Kiev. We also see the rhetoric, the messages, which is strongly indicating that the aim is to change government, to change and remove the democratically elected government in Kiev. We are in close contact with the government of Ukraine. We are, of course, monitoring the situation very closely. It is still a fluid situation. What we have seen is that the Ukrainian forces are fighting bravely and are actually able to inflict damage on the invading Russian forces. But again, it is a very fluid and an evolving situation. NATO allies expressed at the summit today that they provide support to Ukraine. They are ready to continue to provide support to Ukraine, military support, financial support, humanitarian support. And then I think we all have to judge how things evolve. But the message from NATO leaders and also from Finland and Sweden, EU, is that we are there to support Ukraine. We have supported Ukraine for many years and we continue to provide support.
We'll go to the National Press Agency of Ukraine.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. Secretary General, in the current situation which we observe now in Ukraine, does NATO preserve its desire to assist Ukraine with defensive equipment? In particular, can we expect that NATO will provide Ukraine with so badly needed anti-aircraft equipment? Thank you so much.
So NATO allies continue to provide support to Ukraine, and it was actually at the meeting today at the NATO summit with EU and Finland and Sweden, allies announced and also informed all their allies about the type of weapons, the type of support, and some of that also includes air defense systems. So NATO allies have and continue to provide support, military, but also different types of equipment to Ukraine. Then we all realize that, of course, in this very evolving and difficult situation, it's hard to predict what will be the what are the possibilities in the future. But allies are providing support and are very committed to continue to provide support.
Okay, we'll go to NBC, just behind the cameras.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. There's concern that NATO could get pulled into this conflict if Russia were to shut down electricity or other services in Ukraine that could spill over into Poland or Romania. Can you say explicitly whether a Russian cyber attack of that nature would trigger an Article 5 collective defense?
So we are sending a very clear message to Russia that we provide support to our partner Ukraine, and allies provide many different types of support. NATO help Ukraine also with their cyber defenses. But then for NATO allies, we provide the absolute security guarantees under the Washington Treaty, Article 5. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. And we are clear on this distinction because it is important to make sure that we don't have an even bigger crisis in Europe, where Russia challenge or is threatening or attacking any NATO allied country. And that's the reason why we so clearly send a message that we are there to protect all allies and every inch of NATO territory. When it comes to cyber attacks and the risk for incidents and accidents, for instance in the Black Sea, we are pursuing mechanisms of deconfliction to prevent that from happening. We have, as NATO allies, especially the United States, have done that, for instance, in Syria over a long period of time. And we, of course, are very focused. I spoke with Sarkar, the NATO Supreme Commander, on that issue recently, and he is very focused on the need to deconflict to make sure that we don't have incidents or accidents that can spiral and get out of control and create a very dangerous situation. On cyber, well, we have stated that cyber attacks can trigger Article 5, but we have never gone into the position where we give a potential adversary the privilege of defining exactly when we trigger Article 5. We are focused on strengthening our cyber defenses. We are very much aware of that that's a risk, and therefore we are stepping up both the protection of our cyber networks, but also providing support to Ukraine, and we are very focused on the need for deconfliction.
Okay, we'll go to NPR Deutsche Welle. Just
Thank you. Terry Schultz with NPR and DW. I want to know more about the deployment of the NRF forces, please. How many will be sent where, from where? How long will it take to get there? Thinking about military mobility, as always. And also, what has changed in your calculation about the threat to NATO territory that has led allies to make the decision to deploy this for the first time in history for the purposes of collective defense? Thank you.
Well, what has changed over the last days is, of course, that there's a full-fledged invasion of a partner, a country that borders several NATO allied countries. And this is the most serious security crisis we have faced in Europe for decades. And therefore we have the High Readiness Force, we have the NATO Response Force, and that's the reason why we are deploying it, to, again, prevent any miscalculation, any misunderstanding that we are not ready to protect and defend all allies. And of course this is something all allies have agreed to do, 30 allies agreed. But of course, especially those in the eastern part of the alliance are extremely concerned. They are close to this, the fighting in Ukraine, and they also border Russia, and they have seen not only the military build-up and the ongoing war in Ukraine, but they also seen the very threatening rhetoric. Because this goes far beyond Ukraine. This is about how Russia is actually challenging, contesting core values for our security, and demanding that NATO should withdraw all forces and infrastructure from almost half of our members. And they have stated that if you don't do that, if you don't meet their demands, there will be what they call military technical consequences. So we have to take this seriously, and that's exactly why we are now deploying the NATO Response Force for the first time in a collective defense context, and we speak about thousands of troops. We speak about air and maritime capabilities. They are already actually part of the standing naval groups. We have many planes operating in the eastern part of the alliance, and then several allies have partly already assigned troops and forces to the NATO Response Force. We have the lead elements, which are led by France. We have the United States, which has assigned thousands of troops to the NATO Response Force, and these will be deployed to different places in the eastern part of the alliance. Well, they are partly coming from the United States, but these are also very much European troops. For instance, the lead element, the VJTF, the High Readiness Joint Task Force, is now led by France. There's a strong German component there, and other allies also part of that.
Associated Press.
Lorne Cook, Associated Press. Just to follow up on that, Secretary General, the VJTF can only go to one place, and you have 8 allies that are extremely nervous. I mean, where might you send it? Have you identified a particular weakness on that eastern flank?
But I think we have to understand that we have many elements, components of the NATO Response Force. We have increased the readiness of the NATO Response Force, and then I don't speak only about the lead element or the VJTF, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, but we speak about more elements than just that one. Second, we have allies, the United States, but also the United Kingdom and other allies that have increased readiness of forces that are assigned to NATO and the NATO Response Force. So, of course, these are additional forces that we can deploy as part of the broader deployment of the NATO Response Force. I'm not saying that we are deploying the whole force. The size of the NATO Response Force has been tripled since 2014 to roughly 40,000 troops. I'm not saying we're deploying the whole thing. I'm saying that we are deploying elements of the lead, also the VJTF, and elements of the rest of the NATO Response Force. And then it is for SACEUR to make fine decisions exactly where the different elements are deployed, but We activated the defense plans yesterday, and now the elements of this force will be deployed, or is being deployed.
Okay, we'll go to TV2. Lady in white. Lady in white, over there.
Thanks, Elin Sørskal, TV2 Norway. I'll just follow up on AP and what Terry from NPR said. How quick can these troops and this force be deployed?
But some of these forces are already operating because we have sea and air forces, which are also already part of the NATO maritime forces operating from the Barents Sea down to the Mediterranean. Some are air forces, the air component of the NATO response force. And then some of the land forces also can move within a few days because they are part of either the lead element, which has already high readiness, or the other elements that have been put on high readiness. So we speak about days, and some are already operating because we have increased our presence already.
Okay, we'll try to take a couple of questions online. We'll go first to Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, Thomas Kutschka.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon. Secretary General, in the statement that has just been released, it is said that Russia's actions are flagrant rejection of the principles enshrined in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and then it continues, it is Russia that has walked away from its commitments under the Act. Does that mean that NATO now considers the NATO-Russia Founding Act as obsolete, or do NATO member states are they still bound, do they still feel bound by this document? Thanks a lot.
NATO leaders decided today a statement where we clearly state the fact that Russia has walked away. The NATO-Russia Founding Act is based on some core principles enshrined in the Founding Act.
This is Aljazeera. I'm Deni Nabugeda. This is our continuing coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian tanks and soldiers are taking up positions on empty streets across the city center. That's in preparation for a Russian assault. Take a look at the live shot of Ukraine's capital. After another day of aerial bombardment, Russian forces are about 10 kilometers away. That's as fighting rages on in Kiev's outskirts. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed for talks with the Russian president to stop the fighting. Vladimir Putin's proposed to host those talks in Belarus, where his troops are stationed. The Kremlin says Ukraine wants them to be hosted in NATO member Poland instead.